The dormitory fell silent as Captain Natasha Reeves entered, her regulation boots clicking against the polished floor with the measured cadence of someone who had learned to walk through battlefields. The alien cadets, a mixture of towering Kitharan warriors, sleek Valian intellectuals, and crystalline Zephyrite, had been engaged in their usual evening debates about tactical superiority and species hierarchy. Now they watched with barely concealed curiosity as the human instructor made her way to her quarters. Natasha had grown accustomed to the stares. At 34, she was older than most instructors at the Galactic Military Academy, her appointment raising eyebrows across multiple star systems. The prevailing wisdom among the galactic community was that humans were useful cannon fodder, brave enough to charge into danger, too primitive to devise truly sophisticated strategies. They made decent foot soldiers, the thinking went, but lacked the intellectual capacity or physical prowess to lead elite forces. She settled onto her bunk and began her evening ritual, pulling off her boots with practiced efficiency. The leather was worn but immaculately maintained, the kind of care that spoke of military discipline drilled into muscle memory. As she reached for her boot polish, the conversations around her resumed in hushed tones, the cadets stealing glances while pretending to focus on their studies. Kethtar, a 7-foot Kitharan with battle scars already marking his crimson carapace despite his youth, leaned toward his study partner. The human polishes her boots like a ritual, he observed, his mandibles clicking with amusement. Such primitive focus on appearances, no wonder their species struggles with complex warfare. The Valian beside him, her silver skin shifting with subtle bioluminescent patterns that indicated disdain, nodded agreement. Commander Thrix mentioned that humans rely on outdated kinetic weapons and chemical propellants. Their tactics are centuries behind our plasma matrices and quantum displacement strategies. Zarathi, a young Zephyrite whose crystalline form refracted the dormitory lights into prismatic patterns, chimed in with the musical tones of her species. The Academy records show humans have never won a major conflict against advanced species without significant numerical advantage or allied support. Their appointment of this instructor must be some form of diplomatic gesture. Natasha's hands continued their methodical work, spreading the polish across the worn leather with movements that spoke of countless repetitions. The boots were standard military issue, nothing remarkable to an untrained eye, but she treated them with the reverence others might reserve for holy relics. Each stroke of the cloth was deliberate, purposeful, carrying weight that the watching cadets couldn't begin to comprehend. The conversation gradually shifted to other topics. Tomorrow's zero-gravity combat exercise, the upcoming tactical simulation against the Academy's AI systems, speculation about which species would dominate the final rankings. But several sets of eyes remained fixed on the human instructor, watching as she transformed scuffed boots into mirrors that could reflect starlight. What the cadets didn't notice were the details that told a different story. The slight tremor in Natasha's left hand, barely visible but present to those who knew how to look. The way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she worked around a particular scuff mark near the heel of her right boot. The unconscious manner in which she paused at certain spots, her breathing shifting from the steady rhythm of routine maintenance to something deeper, more weighted with memory. The boots had stories to tell, but their keeper remained silent, letting the aliens draw their own conclusions about human simplicity and primitive rituals. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new opportunities for them to discover how wrong their assumptions could be. For now, she simply polished, each circular motion carrying the weight of battles fought in mud and dust, on alien soil under foreign stars, in places these cadets had only read about in sanitized tactical reports. As the evening deepened, and the dormitory lights dimmed to accommodate the various species' circadian preferences, Natasha finished her work and set the boots beside her bunk with the careful precision of a soldier who had learned that equipment maintenance could mean the difference between life and death. Around her, the alien cadets settled into their rest periods, many still casting curious glances at the human who seemed so focused on such trivial tasks. None of them understood yet that they were looking at someone who had walked through fires they couldn't imagine, someone whose simple rituals were anchored in experiences that would reshape everything they thought they knew about warfare, survival, and the species they so casually dismissed. The first test would come sooner than any of them expected, and it would teach them that sometimes the most important lessons came not from advanced weaponry or superior intellect, but from understanding what it truly meant to have walked through hell and chosen to keep walking. Dawn came early at the Galactic Military Academy, the artificial sunrise programmed to accommodate the sleep cycles of 17 different species. Natasha was already awake, as she had been for the past hour, standing at the observation deck that overlooked the training grounds. Her freshly polished boots caught the first rays of synthetic sunlight, their surface reflecting not just light, but the careful attention that had gone into their preparation. The cadets filed into the briefing room with the mixed energy of youth and interspecies competition. Today marked the beginning of their final tactical assessment, a week-long simulation designed to test everything they had learned about modern warfare. The scenario involved a disputed system with multiple strategic objectives, requiring coordination between different species' unique capabilities while managing the inevitable personality conflicts that arose when apex predators from various worlds were forced to work together. Commander Thrix, the Academy's Valian director, stood at the front of the room, her silver skin displaying the formal patterns that indicated official proceedings. Cadets, you will be divided into mixed species units for this assessment. Each team will include representatives from at least 4 different worlds, requiring you to adapt your strategies to accommodate varying physiologies, thought processes, and combat doctrines. The assignments were read with typical military efficiency. Kethtar found himself grouped with Zarathi, 2 other aliens from species Natasha hadn't bothered to memorize, and, to his barely concealed dismay, under the direct supervision of Captain Reeves. The Catharan's mandibles clicked with frustration as he processed this development, his scarred carapace darkening to reflect his mood. "Sir," he addressed Commander Thrix directly, his translated voice carrying undertones that didn't quite survive the linguistic conversion but suggested polite insubordination. "Wouldn't it be more beneficial to have teams led by instructors with proven combat experience against technologically advanced opponents?" The room fell silent. It was a bold challenge, couched in diplomatic language, but unmistakably questioning the human instructor's qualifications. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with the anticipation of those who enjoyed watching authority figures navigate political minefields. Natasha stepped forward, her movement quiet but commanding attention. "Cadet Kethtar raises a valid concern," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced soldiers recognized as more dangerous than shouting. "Combat experience is indeed crucial for effective leadership. Perhaps we should discuss what qualifies as relevant experience." She moved to the holographic display at the front of the room, her boots clicking against the floor with that same measured cadence the cadets had noticed the night before. With a gesture, she activated a star chart showing the disputed system they would be simulating. The Xerian cluster. 3 habitable worlds, 2 asteroid mining facilities, 1 heavily fortified orbital station. Standard tactical doctrine suggests securing the space-based assets first, then methodical planetary conquest using superior firepower. Kethtar's posture straightened slightly. Exactly. The Catharan approach would be to establish orbital supremacy, then deploy atmospheric bombardment to soften planetary defenses before ground insertion. Clean, efficient, minimal casualties to the superior force. The Valian perspective, added his silver-skinned teammate, would emphasize quantum displacement of key installations, removing enemy capability while preserving infrastructure. More elegant than the Kitharan approach, requiring higher intellectual capacity but yielding better strategic outcomes. Zarathi's crystalline form chimed with harmonious tones as she contributed, "My species would focus on harmonic resonance warfare, using sonic disruption to disable enemy coordination while maintaining perfect information networks among our forces. This allows for precise, coordinated strikes that minimize collateral damage while maximizing psychological impact." Natasha nodded thoughtfully, as if considering these perspectives for the first time. All sound approaches, backed by the mathematical precision and technological superiority your species are known for. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled cadets. Of course, I should mention that I've actually been to the Xerion cluster. 7 years ago, the room's atmosphere shifted subtly. Several cadets exchanged glances, processing this unexpected information. The Xerion cluster had been the site of a significant conflict, one that featured prominently in their strategic studies courses as an example of how superior technology could overcome numerical disadvantages. "The Third Xerion War," Commander Thrix said quietly, her skin patterns shifting to display what might have been surprise or calculation. "The records show that conflict was resolved through negotiated settlement after minimal engagement." "The official records," Natasha agreed, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the side of her right boot, where a particular scuff mark told a different story. "What they don't mention is that the negotiated settlement came after a human mercenary unit spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that revealed the true nature of the threat in that system." She gestured again, and the holographic display zoomed in on the third planet of the system, showing detailed topographical information that wasn't available in standard databases. Xerion 3 looked like a standard defensive position: fortified cities, orbital defenses, everything that would suggest a conventional military occupation. But the real danger was underground. The occupying force had discovered something in the planet's core, something that changed the entire strategic picture. The cadets were listening now with the focused attention that came when abstract lessons suddenly connected to real events. Kethtar's earlier skepticism had been replaced by wary interest, while Zarathi's crystalline structure had stilled to the point of perfect clarity that indicated maximum attention among her species. 3 weeks, Natasha continued, of moving through tunnel systems that weren't designed for human physiology, breathing recycled air that burned your lungs after the first day, drinking water that had been purified so many times it tasted like metal and regret, fighting enemies who could see in complete darkness, who could hear your heartbeat from 50 meters away, who had weapons that could punch through any armor we'd ever developed. Her voice remained steady, professional, but something in her posture had changed. The careful military bearing was still there, but now it carried weight that spoke of hard-earned authority. The mission parameters were simple: gather intelligence on enemy capabilities, identify strategic weaknesses, and provide actionable information to the orbital strike teams. Standard reconnaissance, the kind of work that gets assigned to expendable units when the more valuable assets are being held in reserve. She moved to stand directly in front of Kethtar, her smaller human frame somehow commanding attention from the towering Kitharan warrior. What we found was that the enemy wasn't just occupying those worlds, they were strip mining something from the planetary core that would have given them the ability to destabilize entire star systems. The negotiated settlement happened because 3 humans with primitive kinetic weapons and obsolete tactics managed to provide targeting information that turned a potential galactic catastrophe into a footnote in diplomatic history. The silence in the room had weight now, the kind of quiet that came when people realized they were missing crucial pieces of a larger picture. Several cadets were looking at their human instructor with new eyes, beginning to understand that her presence at the academy might not be the diplomatic gesture they had assumed. "But I'm sure," Natasha said, her tone returning to the matter-of-fact delivery of a professional educator, "that your species' superior intellect and advanced technology would have handled the situation more efficiently. After all, What could humans possibly contribute to modern warfare? She turned back to the holographic display, beginning to outline the parameters of their simulation exercise, but the question hung in the air like a challenge none of them were quite ready to answer. The simulation began at 0800 hours, with the kind of organized chaos that marked the beginning of all military exercises. Teams were transported to different sections of the Academy's massive training facility, a complex of interconnected environments that could replicate everything from deep space combat to underground tunnel fighting. Each team was given standard equipment loadouts appropriate to their mission parameters, along with communication gear that would allow the instructors to monitor their progress. Natasha's team found themselves assigned to what the briefing materials described as Phase 2 operations, the ground-based portion of the assault that would begin after the theoretical establishment of orbital supremacy. Their objective was straightforward in concept, complex in execution: infiltrate the enemy's primary command facility, neutralize key personnel, and extract intelligence regarding weapons development programs. The environment they faced was a carefully constructed replica of an underground military installation, complete with atmospheric processors that simulated the thin, chemically hostile air of a disputed world. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows through corridors that had been designed by species with different optical capabilities, creating visibility challenges that varied dramatically depending on one's evolutionary background. Kethtar immediately assumed tactical command, his Catharan training asserting itself through posture and tone. "Standard breach protocol," he announced to the team, his carapace displaying the intimidation patterns that had served his species well in countless conflicts. "I take point with maximum armor configuration. Zarathi provides sensory enhancement and communication coordination. Our Nexari teammate handles technical systems, and the human maintains rear security." It was, Natasha had to admit, a textbook approach to the scenario. Kitharan warriors were indeed formidable in direct assault situations, their natural armor and combat instincts making them ideal for breaking through defended positions. The plan demonstrated solid tactical thinking and appropriate utilization of each species' documented strengths. "Sound strategy," she agreed, checking her equipment with practiced efficiency. Her loadout was standard human military gear, kinetic weapons that the other species considered quaint, armor that provided less protection than Kitharan natural carapace, communication equipment that lacked the quantum entanglement capabilities of Valian technology. To observers, she looked like exactly what the galactic military establishment considered humans to be: useful auxiliaries whose primary value lay in their willingness to accept dangerous assignments that more advanced species preferred to avoid. The first phase of the mission proceeded according to plan. Kethtar's frontal assault capabilities proved effective against the simulated defensive positions they encountered, his plasma weapons cutting through obstacles that would have required human forces to find alternate routes. Zarathi's crystalline physiology allowed her to interface directly with the facility's information networks, providing real-time intelligence that kept them ahead of enemy response patterns. But as they moved deeper into the facility, the nature of the challenge began to change. The corridors became narrower, forcing the larger team members to move single file. The atmospheric processors began introducing trace elements that interfered with some species' sensory capabilities while leaving others unaffected. Emergency lighting gave way to sections of complete darkness interspersed with areas of blinding illumination. "This is inefficient," Kethtar growled as they encountered their third locked security door in as many minutes. His plasma torch, so effective against the earlier obstacles, was proving inadequate against the hardened materials they now faced. The simulation parameters appear to be shifting toward environmental challenges rather than direct combat scenarios. Zarathi's harmonious tones carried undertones of frustration as she attempted to interface with another security system. The network architecture is becoming increasingly complex. It appears to be using multi-layered encryption with physical backup systems that don't respond to quantum manipulation. This level of redundancy suggests paranoid security protocols. Their Nexari teammate, whose species specialized in technological integration, was having similar difficulties with the mechanical systems they encountered. These locks appear to be using hybrid technology, electronic systems backed by physical mechanisms that require manual manipulation. The combination is primitive, but effective against standard infiltration techniques. Natasha had been quiet throughout this discussion, watching her teammates struggle with challenges that seemed designed to negate their natural advantages. When Kethtar finally turned to her with barely concealed frustration, she was ready with an assessment that would change their approach to the mission. "The facility wasn't built by the same species you're used to fighting," she observed, moving forward to examine the security door that had stalled their progress. "Look at the construction details. The height of the access panels, the spacing of the manual controls, the assumption that operators might need to function without technological assistance." She knelt beside the door's base, running her fingers along seams that the others had dismissed as irrelevant structural details. This wasn't designed by advanced species with plasma cutters and quantum manipulation capabilities. This was built by people who assumed their enemies would be using exactly those kinds of tools. Her fingers found what they were looking for, a hidden access panel that had been designed to look like decorative metalwork to anyone not familiar with the specific construction techniques involved. Low-tech contingencies for high-tech problems. The kind of paranoid engineering you get when your species has learned the hard way that superior technology doesn't guarantee victory. The access panel opened to reveal manual override controls that bypassed the electronic systems entirely. Within moments, the security door slid open with a mechanical grinding that spoke of physical gears and counterweights rather than gravitic manipulation fields. "How did you know?" Zarathi asked, her crystalline form shifting to reflect genuine curiosity rather than the polite attention she had shown previously. Natasha was already moving toward the next obstacle, her worn boots finding purchase on surfaces that seemed to challenge the other's balance. "Because I've seen this kind of construction before. The people who built this place learned to fight enemies who could cut through any armor, hack any computer system, and overwhelm any conventional defense. So they built things that could be operated by someone with primitive tools, basic training, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from having no backup plan." She paused at the entrance to what their briefing materials indicated was the facility's central command section, studying the approaches with eyes that saw patterns the others were missing. "The question is, do you want to keep trying to use advanced tactics against an enemy who's specifically prepared for them? Or are you ready to learn why humans are still here after all these years of supposedly being obsolete?" The challenge hung in the air between them, marking a turning point in the exercise that none of the cadets had expected. Their sophisticated strategies and superior capabilities had brought them this far, but the path ahead would require adapting to an enemy who had learned to turn technological superiority into a weakness rather than an advantage. What happened next would determine not just their success in the simulation, but their understanding of why the galaxy's most primitive species had somehow earned a place training the next generation of elite warriors. The facility's central command section presented challenges that defied conventional military doctrine. The layout seemed deliberately designed to frustrate species accustomed to technological solutions, corridors that branched and reconnected in patterns that confused quantum navigation systems, chambers with irregular acoustics that disrupted harmonic communication methods, and security measures that relied on physical locks, manual overrides, and analog backup systems. Cathatar's frustration was becoming evident in the darkening patterns across his carapace and the increasingly sharp clicks of his mandibles. "This is barbaric," he muttered as they encountered another mechanically locked door. What kind of military installation relies on physical keys and manual controls in an age of quantum encryption and neural interfaces? The kind that expects to be attacked by enemies with quantum encryption and neural interfaces, Natasha replied, her tone carrying the patience of someone who had explained this concept many times before. She was studying the lock mechanism with the focused attention of an expert, her fingers tracing metal components that had been crafted with deliberate simplicity. The lock itself was a masterpiece of paranoid engineering, multiple physical tumblers that required precise manipulation, backed by mechanical systems that would function even if all electronic components were destroyed. To species accustomed to technological solutions, it represented an almost insulting regression to primitive methods. But to someone who understood the logic behind such systems, it was elegant in its crude effectiveness. "Watch," Natasha said, producing a set of tools from her equipment pack that the others hadn't noticed before. They were simple implements, thin metal pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern military loadout. Lockpicking is considered an obsolete skill in most advanced militaries. Why waste time learning manual techniques when you have quantum manipulators and molecular disruptors? Her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this operation countless times under significantly more dangerous circumstances than a training simulation. The lock's tumblers responded to her manipulation with soft metallic clicks that spoke of mechanical simplicity and analog reliability. "The answer," she continued as she worked, "is that every technological solution can be countered by someone with sufficient resources and intelligence. Quantum encryption can be broken, neural interfaces can be hacked, plasma cutters can be deflected by appropriate materials, but a purely mechanical system?" The lock clicked open with the satisfying sound of precision engineering. Someone still has to physically manipulate the components. Zarathi's crystalline form had been observing this demonstration with growing interest. "Your species developed these techniques as compensation for technological limitations," she stated, but her tone had shifted from dismissive to analytical, necessity forcing innovation in areas that more advanced species had abandoned. "Necessity, yes," Natasha agreed, pushing the door open to reveal the command center beyond. "But also, philosophy. Human military doctrine has always assumed that any advantage can be temporary, any superiority can be overcome, any technology can fail. So we developed redundancies, backup plans, and the kind of low-tech solutions that work when everything else breaks down." The command center itself was a study in contrasts. The central display systems showed the kind of holographic sophistication that marked advanced military installations, but the underlying infrastructure was deliberately primitive. Physical control panels backed up digital interfaces, manual switches provided alternatives to voice commands, and hard copy documentation supplemented electronic records. Their mission parameters required them to extract intelligence regarding weapons development programs, but the information was stored in systems that seemed designed to frustrate conventional data extraction techniques. Multiple layers of security included not just electronic encryption, but physical isolation of critical components, requiring manual access to terminals that were scattered throughout the facility. Kethtar's approach to this challenge reflected his species' preference for direct solutions. "We should divide the team to cover multiple access points simultaneously," he proposed, his tactical training asserting itself despite their earlier difficulties. Maximum efficiency through parallel operations. It was sound military thinking, the kind of approach that would work well against enemies who relied on conventional defensive strategies. But Natasha was studying the command center's layout with eyes that saw patterns her teammates were missing, subtle design elements that suggested the facility's builders had anticipated exactly this kind of assault. "Look at the positioning of those terminals," she said, pointing to access points that appeared to be randomly distributed throughout the chamber. "They seem scattered, but there's a pattern. Each one is positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for defenders, while creating blind spots that would channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. She moved through the chamber with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield, her worn boots finding paths that avoided the most obvious danger areas. This isn't just a command center, it's a trap. The intelligence we need is real, but it's bait. The moment we start accessing those terminals simultaneously, we trigger defensive systems that are designed to eliminate teams using standard tactical approaches. The implications of this assessment were significant. If Natasha was correct, their mission success depended not on efficiently dividing their efforts, but on understanding the psychology of the facility's designers well enough to avoid their carefully prepared countermeasures. "Then how do we proceed?" asked their Nexari teammate, whose species' technological expertise was proving less relevant than usual in this environment. If conventional approaches trigger defensive responses, what alternative methods remain available? Natasha was already moving toward what appeared to be the least important terminal in the chamber, positioned in a location that seemed to offer minimal strategic value. "We think like people who learn to fight enemies with superior technology, better training, and overwhelming numerical advantages. We don't try to match their strengths. We find weaknesses they didn't know they had." Her approach to the terminal was careful, methodical, informed by understanding of systems that relied on mechanical backups and analog redundancies. Instead of attempting direct electronic access, she began with physical examination of the hardware, looking for the kind of manual overrides that paranoid engineers built into systems they expected to fail under hostile conditions. "The main terminals are obviously trapped," she explained as she worked, "but maintenance access, emergency procedures, the boring, unglamorous systems that keep facilities running when everything else breaks down." Her fingers found a concealed panel that opened to reveal manual diagnostic controls. Those are usually protected by nothing more sophisticated than a basic lock and the assumption that attackers will ignore them in favor of more obvious targets. The diagnostic terminal provided access to maintenance logs, system status reports, and operational procedures that would have seemed irrelevant to most infiltration teams. But buried within the mundane data were references to special projects, security protocols for classified materials, and facility layouts that revealed the true purpose of the installation. "Weapons Development Program," Natasha read from the maintenance logs, her voice carrying satisfaction at a mission objective achieved through unconventional methods. Codename Project Underminer, development of defensive systems specifically designed to counter advanced military technologies. Test subjects include representative weapons and tactics from 17 different species. The information was exactly what their mission parameters required, obtained through methods that had bypassed the facility's primary security systems entirely. But more than just intelligence gathering, the exercise had demonstrated principles that none of the alien cadets had expected to encounter from their human instructor. As they prepared to extract from the facility, Kethtar found himself reassessing assumptions he had held about human military capabilities. The methods they had used were indeed primitive by galactic standards, but their effectiveness in this environment suggested that primitiveness might not be the weakness he had assumed. The real lesson was still to come, but the foundation had been laid. Sometimes the most advanced solution was learning when not to rely on advancement at all. The extraction phase of the mission revealed the true scope of the facility's defensive systems. As Natasha's team prepared to leave with their intelligence data, proximity sensors activated security protocols that had remained dormant during their infiltration. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in harsh red illumination, while mechanical sirens echoed through passages that suddenly seemed narrower, more claustrophobic, designed to channel intruders into predetermined engagement areas. "Defensive systems activating," Zarathi reported, her crystalline form resonating with harmonic frequencies that allowed her to interface with the facility's sensor networks. Multiple automated turrets deploying from concealed positions. energy weapon signatures consistent with plasma discharge systems, ion beam projectors, and molecular disruptors. The weapons array that emerged from hidden panels throughout the facility represented a comprehensive collection of advanced military technology. Each turret system was designed to counter specific types of armor and defensive measures, creating overlapping fields of fire that would challenge even the most sophisticated assault teams. Against conventional opponents, the defensive network would have been devastatingly effective. Kethtar's combat instincts took over as he assessed their tactical situation. "Standard suppression protocol," he announced, his carapace shifting to maximum armor configuration while his plasma rifle charged to full power. "Advance by fire and movement, suppress defensive positions, break through to extraction point through superior firepower." It was textbook infantry tactics, the kind of approach that had served Catharan warriors well in countless conflicts across the galaxy. Against most enemies, the combination of natural armor, advanced weapons, and aggressive assault doctrine would have been sufficient to overcome defensive positions like those they now faced. But the first exchange of fire revealed that the facility's defensive systems had been designed by engineers who understood exactly how advanced species would respond to this kind of threat. Kethtar's plasma discharge was intercepted by energy-dampening fields that dispersed the attack's effectiveness, while targeting systems locked onto his position with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of Catharan combat patterns. "Weapons are adapted to counter our species' standard approaches," he growled as he took cover behind a structural support that was already showing stress fractures from concentrated enemy fire. "They know our tactics, our capabilities, our preferred engagement ranges." Zarathi's attempts to disrupt the defensive network through harmonic interference were similarly frustrated. "The systems are using physical backup controls that don't respond to quantum manipulation," she reported, her usually melodious tones carrying frustration. "They appear to be operating on purely mechanical targeting mechanisms with analog fire control systems." Their Nexari teammate was discovering similar limitations with the technological approaches that typically guaranteed his species' battlefield success. "Electronic countermeasures are ineffective against systems that don't rely on standard processing architectures," he confirmed. "These defensive positions appear to be designed specifically to neutralize the advantages that make our species militarily dominant." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Advanced weapons and superior technology were proving insufficient against defensive systems that had been engineered by someone who understood exactly how advanced species fought and had designed countermeasures accordingly. Their extraction route was covered by interlocking fields of fire that seemed to anticipate every approach they might attempt. "Fascinating," Natasha observed from her position behind cover that provided better protection than her teammates had managed to find. Her assessment of the situation was delivered with the calm professional interest of someone analyzing an academic problem rather than facing immediate life-threatening danger. "They built this place to counter everything that makes you effective in combat." She was studying the defensive positions with eyes that saw patterns the others were missing, subtle details in the turret placement, firing angles that created specific dead zones, timing patterns in the automated systems that suggested underlying mechanical limitations. But they made one critical assumption about the kind of enemies they'd be facing. Moving with careful precision, she began working her way toward a position that appeared to offer no tactical advantage, a maintenance alcove that provided minimal cover and no clear firing angles toward the defensive network. Her teammates watched with growing confusion as she seemed to ignore the primary threat in favor of what looked like a suicide approach. "They assumed their enemies would fight like advanced military forces," she continued, her voice carrying clearly despite the ongoing weapons fire. "Superior technology, sophisticated tactics, overwhelming firepower applied through conventional assault doctrine. They prepared for everything except someone who learned to fight with inferior equipment against superior opponents." Her hands were working with components that had been concealed within her equipment pack, simple tools and materials that looked primitive compared to the advanced weaponry her teammates carried. Chemical explosives rather than plasma charges, mechanical timing devices instead of quantum processors, detonation systems that relied on analog circuits rather than digital programming. Improvised explosive devices, she explained as she assembled components with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this operation under combat conditions. Crude, unreliable by galactic standards, but effective against systems that aren't designed to detect pre-industrial chemical signatures. The concept was so primitive that it took several moments for her teammates to understand what she was proposing. Explosive devices that relied on chemical reactions rather than energy manipulation, triggered by mechanical systems that operated independently of electronic networks, designed to cause structural damage rather than precise target elimination. "You're proposing to destroy the facility's infrastructure," Kethtar said, his tone carrying disbelief at such a crude solution. "Collateral damage, massive destruction, complete abandonment of precision warfare doctrine." "I'm proposing to win," Natasha replied, placing her improvised charges in locations that would compromise the structural supports for the automated turret systems. Precision is a luxury you can afford when you have technological superiority. When you don't, you use whatever works. The charges detonated in sequence, creating cascading failures throughout the defensive network as support structures collapsed and power distribution systems failed. Chemical explosions produced electromagnetic pulses that disrupted electronic systems, while mechanical shock waves damaged precision-calibrated targeting mechanisms. Within seconds, the sophisticated defensive network was reduced to scattered, non-functional wreckage. "Extraction route is clear," Natasha announced, her tone carrying the satisfaction of a problem solved through appropriate application of available resources. Mission objectives achieved, intelligence data secured, defensive systems neutralized. But as her teammates followed her through corridors now littered with the debris of failed technology, they were processing implications that extended far beyond a successful training exercise. They had witnessed someone who appeared primitively equipped overcome defensive systems specifically designed to neutralize their own advanced capabilities. The human instructor who had polished her boots with such careful attention the night before had just demonstrated why those boots had earned the right to such reverence, and why the battles they had walked through might be more significant than anyone had assumed. The debriefing session took place in the Academy's primary conference room, a circular chamber designed to accommodate the varied physiological needs of multiple species while maintaining the formal atmosphere appropriate to military analysis. Holographic displays showed tactical recordings from each team's performance during the simulation, allowing instructors and cadets to review decisions, outcomes, and lessons learned through objective examination of recorded data. Commander Thrix stood at the center of the room, her silver skin displaying the neutral patterns that indicated official proceedings, while her eyes held the calculating expression that marked her species' analytical nature. The other teams had performed according to expectations, successful mission completion through application of their species' documented capabilities, with results that validated established tactical doctrines and training methods. But the recordings from Natasha's team showed something different. Where other teams had succeeded through superior firepower, advanced technology, or sophisticated coordination, her team had achieved their objectives through methods that seemed to contradict everything the Academy taught about modern warfare. "Captain Reeves," Commander Thrix began, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating potentially sensitive political territory, "your team's approach to the simulation exercise was unconventional. Perhaps you could explain the tactical reasoning behind your methods." The question hung in the air, with weight that suggested this debriefing would cover more than just routine performance analysis. Around the room, cadets from other teams leaned forward with the focused attention that came when abstract lessons suddenly connected to concrete demonstrations they had witnessed. Natasha stood with the relaxed posture of someone comfortable defending decisions made under pressure. The simulation parameters indicated we were facing enemies who had specifically prepared countermeasures for advanced military capabilities, she replied. Under those circumstances, attempting to defeat them using the exact methods they had prepared to counter would have been tactically unsound. Kethtar, still processing the implications of what he had witnessed, spoke with the careful tone of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. But the methods you employed, improvised explosives, mechanical systems, analog approaches to electronic problems, these represent significant regression from established military doctrine. They represent adaptation, Natasha corrected, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had explained this concept many times to different audiences. Military doctrine should serve mission objectives, not the other way around. When superior technology becomes a liability rather than an advantage, tactics must evolve accordingly. She gestured toward the holographic displays showing recordings from their mission. The facility we infiltrated wasn't defended by inferior opponents using outdated methods. It was defended by enemies who understood exactly how advanced military forces operate and had prepared accordingly. Against such opponents, advanced capabilities become predictable weaknesses rather than decisive advantages. Zarathi's crystalline form resonated with harmonic frequencies that indicated deep contemplation. Your species developed these alternative approaches through necessity, she observed. Facing enemies with superior technology forced innovation in areas that more advanced species had abandoned as obsolete. Necessity, yes, Natasha agreed, but also philosophy. Human military doctrine assumes that any advantage can be temporary, any technology can fail, any strategy can be countered. So we maintained capabilities that other species considered primitive, not because we preferred them, but because we understood they might be necessary when more sophisticated methods proved insufficient. Commander Thrix's skin patterns shifted to display what might have been concern or calculation. These methods, improvised explosives, lock-picking, analog systems manipulation, represent knowledge that could be problematic if widely disseminated among cadet populations from various species. The implication was clear. What Natasha had demonstrated wasn't just alternative tactical doctrine, but skills that could be applied beyond military contexts, capabilities that could threaten the technological superiority that maintained galactic political balances. Lockpicking could defeat security systems, improvised explosives could damage infrastructure, analog approaches could bypass quantum encryption that protected commercial and governmental networks. Which brings us to the more significant question, Natasha said, her tone carrying weight that suggested they were approaching the heart of the matter. Why does the Galactic Military Academy have a human instructor whose boots have walked through conflicts that aren't mentioned in official records? She moved to stand beside the holographic display, her reflection merging with the tactical recordings in a way that emphasized the connection between theory and experience. The Third Xerian War that I mentioned yesterday, the Kitharic suppression campaign 3 years before that, the Valian border incidents that were resolved through diplomatic channels 5 years ago, the Nexari corporate conflict that officially never happened at all. Each name she mentioned caused subtle reactions among the assembled cadets, shifts in posture, changes in skin coloration, harmonic frequencies that indicated recognition among species whose governments had been involved in those conflicts. Events that had been classified, minimized, or completely denied in official records were being acknowledged by someone who spoke with the authority of direct participation. What do these conflicts have in common? Natasha asked, though her tone suggested she would be providing the answer herself. They were all situations where conventional military doctrine failed against enemies who had studied galactic tactical preferences and prepared accordingly. They were resolved not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the application of methods that advanced species had dismissed as obsolete. Kethtar's carapace had darkened to the deep crimson that indicated profound contemplation among his species. "You're suggesting that human participation in these conflicts was more significant than official records indicate," he said slowly, processing implications that extended far beyond training exercises. "I'm stating that human participation was essential," Natasha replied, "because when your enemies understand your strengths well enough to neutralize them, survival depends on capabilities they don't expect you to possess. Lock-picking when they've prepared for quantum manipulation. Chemical explosives when they've shielded against energy weapons. Analog communications when they've compromised quantum networks." She turned to face the assembled cadets directly, her worn boots clicking against the floor with that same measured cadence they had noticed the first night. But now the sound carried different meaning, the footsteps of someone who had walked through situations that had shaped galactic history in ways that would never appear in official documentation. "The boots I polish every night," she said quietly, "have walked through 12 different war zones across 8 star systems over the past 15 years. Places where human units were sent because someone needed soldiers who could fight effectively with primitive equipment against technologically superior opponents. Places where the outcome mattered enough that governments were willing to employ methods they officially condemned." Commander Thrix's skin patterns had shifted to display deep concern, the kind of expression that suggested political complications beyond simple military considerations. "Captain Reeves, these are matters that fall under multiple classification levels and interspecies diplomatic agreements." "These are matters," Natasha countered, "that explain why a supposedly primitive species has earned the right to train the next generation of galactic military leaders, because sometimes the most advanced solution is understanding when advancement itself becomes a weakness." She gestured again at the holographic displays showing their successful mission completion through methods that violated every principle of modern warfare doctrine. "Your species have spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated ways to fight each other. Plasma weapons that can cut through any armor, quantum manipulation that can override any security system, harmonic warfare that can coordinate perfect tactical responses across vast distances." The cadets listened with growing understanding as she outlined capabilities they had assumed represented permanent advantages in any conflict scenario. But what happens when your enemies have studied your capabilities for generations and built countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize everything that makes you militarily dominant? What happens when your plasma weapons encounter energy-dampening fields, your quantum manipulation faces analog backup systems, your harmonic coordination meets opponents who function through primitive radio communication? The answer hung in the air like a challenge that none of them could ignore. Advanced species had achieved military dominance through technological superiority, but that superiority was based on assumptions about the nature of future conflicts that might not hold against enemies who understood their weaknesses. Humans, Natasha concluded, learned to fight as the technologically inferior force against opponents with every conceivable advantage. We developed tactics for situations where our weapons were outclassed, our equipment was inadequate, and our only hope for survival was finding weaknesses that our enemies didn't know they had. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across faces that represented the military elite of multiple species, all of them reassessing fundamental assumptions about warfare, technology, and the hierarchies that shaped galactic civilization. "The question you need to answer," she said finally, "is whether you want to continue fighting the last war with methods that worked against predictable opponents, or whether you're ready to learn how to fight the next war against enemies who have learned to turn your strengths into weaknesses." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that extended far beyond the confines of a military academy. They were discussing the foundations of galactic military doctrine, questioning assumptions that had shaped interspecies relationships for centuries, and confronting the possibility that their technological advantages might not guarantee future victory. But more than theoretical considerations, they were looking at someone whose boots carried the weight of conflicts that had already tested these principles under conditions where failure meant more than poor performance evaluations. Someone who had walked through fires that would reshape everything they thought they knew about warfare, survival, and the species they had dismissed as primitive auxiliaries. The real lesson was just beginning, and it would teach them that sometimes the most important knowledge came not from advanced instruction, but from understanding what it truly meant to fight when every advantage belonged to the enemy. The weeks following the simulation exercise brought subtle but significant changes to the dynamics within the academy. Word of the unconventional methods demonstrated by Captain Reeves had spread through the cadet population with the kind of velocity that marked information too important to be contained by official channels. Students who had previously viewed their human instructor as a diplomatic courtesy began requesting additional training sessions, asking questions that went beyond standard curriculum requirements. Natasha found herself conducting informal seminars that covered subjects not typically included in advanced military education, lock-picking techniques that could defeat security systems designed to resist quantum manipulation, improvised explosive construction using materials available in standard emergency supplies, communication protocols that functioned through electromagnetic interference that would disable quantum entanglement networks. The skills she taught were simple by human standards, basic survival techniques that any infantry soldier would be expected to master during fundamental training. But to species accustomed to technological solutions for every tactical challenge, these analog capabilities represented revolutionary approaches to problems they had never expected to encounter. Kethtar had become one of her most dedicated students, his initial skepticism replaced by the focused attention of a warrior recognizing superior tactical knowledge. During a late evening training session, he watched with intense concentration as Natasha demonstrated the construction of a chemical explosive device using components that could be salvaged from a damaged spacecraft's life support systems. "The timing mechanism is purely mechanical," she explained, her hands working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this operation under significantly more dangerous circumstances than a training facility. No electronic components to be detected by scanning systems, no quantum signatures to be traced by countermeasures, no energy emissions to reveal your position during assembly. The device she constructed looked crude compared to the sophisticated weapon systems that represented standard military equipment. Chemical explosive rather than plasma charge, mechanical timer instead of quantum processor, detonation system that relied on analog circuits rather than digital programming. But its very primitiveness made it invisible to detection methods designed to identify advanced military hardware. "Your species' engineers would consider this barbaric," Kethtar observed, his mandibles clicking with the rapid pattern that indicated intense analytical processing. Yet against opponents prepared for advanced weaponry, such devices would be devastatingly effective. "Effectiveness matters more than sophistication," Natasha replied, disassembling the demonstration device with the same careful attention she gave to polishing her boots each evening. "Barbarism is a luxury you can afford when you have technological superiority. When you don't, you use whatever works." Zarathi had joined these informal training sessions as well, her crystalline form reflecting the harsh light of the workshop where Natasha conducted her unconventional instruction. The harmonic resonance patterns that marked her species' communication carried undertones of fascination as she attempted to understand the philosophical implications of what she was learning. "Your approach to warfare assumes continuous technological disadvantage," she observed, her melodious tones carrying analytical depth that suggested profound contemplation. "Every technique you demonstrate is designed for scenarios where the enemy possesses superior capabilities in every conventional category. Because that's the reality humans faced in every significant conflict for the past century," Natasha confirmed. "We never fought enemies who were less advanced than we were. We never had superior numbers, or better equipment, or more sophisticated tactics. We learned to win by finding weaknesses that our enemies didn't know they had. She gestured toward the collection of improvised tools and weapons that filled the workshop, devices that looked like museum pieces compared to standard military equipment, but had proven their effectiveness in situations where standard equipment had failed. Superior technology breeds predictable tactics. Predictable tactics create exploitable weaknesses. Exploitable weaknesses can be turned into decisive advantages by someone willing to think like the inferior force. The concept was challenging fundamental assumptions that shaped how these species approached military problems. Their entire tactical doctrine was based on leveraging superior capabilities to overcome enemy resistance through application of overwhelming technological advantage. The idea that such advantages could become liabilities required reconceptualizing the nature of warfare itself, but the proof was undeniable. In simulation after simulation, teams trained in human methodology were achieving objectives that conventional approaches had failed to accomplish, not through superior firepower or advanced coordination, but through application of methods that opponents had never prepared to counter. Commander Thrix had been monitoring these developments with growing concern that extended beyond simple military considerations. The techniques being taught represented capabilities that could threaten the technological hierarchies that maintained galactic political stability. Lockpicking could defeat security systems protecting commercial installations. Improvised explosives could damage infrastructure that supported interspecies trade networks. Analog communication methods could bypass quantum encryption that protected governmental and military networks. During a private meeting in her office, she confronted Natasha with questions that went to the heart of galactic security policy. Captain Reeves, the skills you're teaching these cadets have applications that extend far beyond military contexts. There are legitimate concerns about the proliferation of such knowledge among populations from various species. Natasha sat with the relaxed posture of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared accordingly. Commander, the knowledge I'm teaching isn't secret. Every technique I've demonstrated can be found in historical human military manuals that are available through standard research channels. The difference is that most species never bothered to study them because they considered the methods obsolete. Obsolete methods that are proving remarkably effective against modern defensive systems, Commander Thrix replied, her skin patterns displaying the complex combination of concern and calculation that marked her species' approach to political problems. The implications for galactic security could be significant. The implications for galactic security are already significant, Natasha countered, because the conflicts I mentioned, Xerion, Kitharic, Valian, Nexari, weren't isolated incidents. They were test cases. Someone has been systematically studying the tactical preferences of every major species and developing countermeasures accordingly. The statement hung in the air with weight that suggested implications far beyond the scope of military academy politics. Commander Thrix's skin patterns shifted to display the deep concern that came when local problems revealed connections to larger strategic threats. You're suggesting coordinated intelligence gathering on a galactic scale, she said slowly, processing implications that would require immediate communication with governmental authorities across multiple star systems. Long-term analysis of military capabilities with the goal of developing comprehensive countermeasures. I'm stating that someone has been preparing for a conflict where all of your technological advantages would be neutralized, Natasha replied. Someone who understands that the key to defeating advanced species isn't matching their capabilities, but making those capabilities irrelevant. She stood and moved to the office's observation window, looking out at the training grounds where cadets from multiple species were practicing the unconventional techniques she had taught them. The question isn't whether such knowledge should be proliferated. The question is whether you want your military forces to be prepared for enemies who have already learned to counter everything that makes you think you're invincible. The silence that followed carried weight that extended far beyond the confines of a single conversation. They were discussing threats that could reshape the balance of power across galactic civilization, challenges that would require fundamental changes to military doctrine that had remained stable for centuries. But more than theoretical concerns, they were confronting the reality that the boots Natasha polished each evening had walked through conflicts that were part of a larger pattern, preparation for a war that advanced species didn't know they were already fighting, against enemies who had learned to turn technological superiority into fatal weakness. The real conflict was approaching, and when it arrived, the galaxy would discover why humans had earned the right to train the next generation of warriors, and why the methods they considered primitive might be the only hope for survival against opponents who had spent generations learning to make advancement itself a form of vulnerability. The emergency alert came at 0347 hours, cutting through the Academy's night cycle with the harsh urgency that marked genuine crisis rather than training exercise. Natasha was awake instantly, her combat instincts responding to the particular frequency pattern that indicated actual threat rather than simulated emergency. Around her, alien cadets struggled to process the sudden transition from sleep to full alert status, their various physiologies requiring different adaptation periods for optimal performance. The briefing room filled with controlled chaos as instructors and senior cadets assembled to receive threat assessment information. Commander Thrix stood at the center of the room, her skin patterns displaying the deep crimson that indicated maximum crisis status among her species. The holographic displays showed star charts with threat indicators that painted a picture of coordinated attacks across multiple systems. At 0315 hours, simultaneous strikes were launched against military installations in the Kitharan, Valian, and Nexari home systems, she announced, her voice carrying the professional calm that marked experienced military officers delivering catastrophic news. Initial reports indicate coordinated attacks using weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter each species' primary defensive capabilities. The implications were staggering. Coordinated strikes across that many light years required planning, resources, and intelligence gathering on a scale that suggested preparation measured in decades rather than months. More troubling were the reports of tactical approaches that seemed designed by enemies who understood exactly how each species would respond to conventional threats. Kitharan orbital platforms were neutralized by energy-dampening fields that rendered plasma weapons ineffective, Commander Thrix continued, reading from reports that were still arriving from across the galaxy. Valian quantum defense networks were bypassed using analog targeting systems that couldn't be detected or countered by standard electronic warfare measures. Nexari technological integration systems were disabled by electromagnetic pulse weapons that destroyed their cybernetic interfaces while leaving purely mechanical backup systems untouched. Kethtar's carapace had darkened to the deep black that indicated shock among his species. They knew exactly how our defenses would operate, he said slowly, processing implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic security. Every countermeasure was specifically designed to neutralize our species' primary advantages. It gets worse, Commander Thrix replied, activating additional displays that showed tactical analysis from the attacked installations. Preliminary reports indicate the attacking forces used predominantly low-technology weapons and analog communication systems, chemical explosives rather than energy weapons, mechanical targeting instead of quantum calculation, radio communication rather than entanglement networks. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had launched coordinated attacks against the most heavily defended installations in galactic space, using exactly the kinds of primitive methods that Natasha had been teaching their cadets to employ. Methods that advanced species had dismissed as obsolete were proving devastatingly effective against defensive systems designed to counter sophisticated threats. "Captain Reeves," Commander Thrix said, her tone carrying weight that suggested this conversation would determine more than just Academy policy. Your assessment of these attack patterns would be valuable." Natasha stood with the calm posture of someone who had been expecting this development for longer than her colleagues had realized. "The attacks were conducted by forces trained in human methodology," she stated with the certainty of professional analysis. "Not necessarily humans, but someone who learned to fight the way humans learn to fight, as the technologically inferior force against opponents with every conceivable advantage." She moved to the holographic displays, studying attack patterns with eyes that saw connections the others were missing. "Look at the timing coordination, not quantum synchronization, but mechanical precision, the kind you get from people using analog chronometers rather than entanglement clocks. Look at the target selection, not the most strategically valuable installations, but the ones most heavily defended by the specific technologies these attackers knew how to counter." Zarathi's crystalline form resonated with harmonic frequencies that indicated deep analytical processing. "You're suggesting that our enemies learned human tactical doctrine and applied it against targets they had studied extensively," she said, her melodious tones carrying implications that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. "I'm suggesting that your enemies are humans," Natasha replied, her words falling into the briefing room silence like stones into still water. "Or rather, humans who decided that serving as auxiliary forces for species who considered them primitive was less appealing than demonstrating exactly how effective those primitive methods could be when applied with sufficient preparation and coordination." The implications were staggering. If human forces were responsible for these attacks, it meant that the species most other races considered useful but ultimately dispensable had been systematically studying galactic military capabilities while developing countermeasures that could neutralize every advanced defensive system in known space. "That's impossible," Kethtar protested, his mandibles clicking with the rapid pattern that indicated intense analytical processing. "Human forces lack the resources for coordinated strikes across multiple star systems. They don't have the spacecraft, the logistics networks, or the organizational infrastructure for operations on this scale. Human forces as auxiliary units lack those capabilities," Natasha agreed. "But human forces as an independent military organization, with decades to prepare and access to intelligence from every conflict they participated in as auxiliary support?" She paused, letting the implications settle among her audience. "The species you thought were too primitive to be a threat spent 15 years fighting alongside you, learning your tactics, studying your weaknesses, and developing countermeasures for every advantage you thought made you invincible." Commander Thrix's skin patterns had shifted to display what might have been fear or calculation, the kind of expression that came when local problems revealed connections to existential threats. "You're describing a systematic intelligence-gathering operation spanning decades, conducted by forces we trusted with access to our most sensitive military installations. I'm describing exactly what any intelligent species would do if they found themselves classified as expendable auxiliaries by people who considered them primitive," Natasha replied. "Learn everything possible about your employer's capabilities, develop methods to counter those capabilities, and wait for the appropriate moment to demonstrate that primitiveness can be a significant advantage when properly applied." The emergency alert systems activated again, indicating new threat information arriving from the combat zones. The displays updated to show expanded attack patterns that painted an even more disturbing picture of coordinated assault across galactic civilization's most important military installations. But more than immediate tactical concerns, the assembled officers and cadets were confronting the reality that their assumptions about galactic military hierarchy had been fundamentally wrong. The species they had dismissed as useful but ultimately inferior had been systematically preparing for a conflict that would demonstrate exactly why those primitive methods had earned the right to train the next generation of warriors. The war they thought they understood was about to become a war that would challenge everything they believed about technology, superiority, and survival against enemies who had learned to turn advancement itself into a fatal weakness. And the boots that had walked through 12 different conflicts were about to carry their owner into the most significant battle of all, the one that would determine whether galactic civilization could adapt quickly enough to survive against opponents who had spent decades learning to make their greatest strengths into decisive vulnerabilities. The emergency briefing concluded with orders that no one in the room had expected to receive. Instead of evacuation or defensive positioning, the Academy was being designated as a critical strategic asset, the only facility in galactic space with personnel trained in the unconventional methods that were proving effective against the attacking forces. Within hours, the Academy would be transformed from an educational institution into an active command center for military operations that would determine the outcome of a conflict none of them had seen coming. Natasha found herself appointed as tactical advisor to emergency response forces being assembled from across the galaxy, her unconventional expertise suddenly elevated from academic curiosity to essential military capability. The boots she had polished with such careful attention each evening would soon be walking through another conflict zone, but this time as an instructor teaching survival techniques to species who were learning that their technological superiority had become a fatal liability. As she prepared for deployment, surrounded by cadets who now understood why their human instructor had been appointed to train the galaxy's elite forces, Natasha reflected on the irony of the situation. The species who had spent centuries considering humans too primitive to pose a serious threat were now depending on human methodology to survive against enemies who had learned exactly how devastating primitiveness could be when properly applied. The real war was just beginning, and it would be fought not with the advanced weapons and sophisticated tactics that had defined galactic military doctrine for centuries, but with the simple, brutal effectiveness of methods that worked when everything else failed. Methods that had been tested in 12 different conflicts, refined through hard experience, and proven in situations where survival depended on finding weaknesses that superior opponents didn't know they possessed. The cadets who had once dismissed human boot polishing as pointless ritual now understood that they were looking at someone whose feet had carried her through experiences that would reshape their understanding of warfare itself. The weight of those experiences, polished into every scuff mark and worn into every crease of leather that had walked across battlefields they couldn't imagine, would soon teach the galaxy why sometimes the most advanced solution was learning when advancement itself became the enemy. In the end, the boots that had walked through a dozen wars would walk through one more. The war that would determine whether galactic civilization could learn quickly enough to survive against enemies who had spent decades mastering the art of turning strength into weakness, sophistication into vulnerability, and technological superiority into the foundation of their own defeat. The question was no longer whether humans belonged among the galaxy's military elite. The question was whether the galaxy's military elite could learn to think like humans quickly enough to survive what was coming. And as Natasha laced up her boots for what might be the most important mission of her career, she knew that the answer would be written in the outcome of battles fought not with plasma weapons and quantum manipulation, but with the simple, primitive, devastatingly effective methods that had earned humanity the right to train the next generation of warriors. The war for galactic survival would be won or lost by how well advanced species could learn to fight like the primitive auxiliaries they had always assumed they could afford to underestimate.